Good everyone. I hope you guys have an amazing day. So what I'll do today, I will be talking about the few things which I look for when I interview somebody for a Salesforce developer role. Right now, I've created a few videos in the past where I explained the things you should know before you go and appear for a developer interview. That's especially Salesforce developer, right? Now, I've interviewed a lot of people. Even this year, I have interviewed a few guys for an Apex role as well as for a Salesforce developer role, doesn't mean including Omni Studio, um, and even for a DevOps engineer role, right? I got a lot of experience in Salesforce platform and as well as in general in the development space because I work as a uh, technical architect in one of the government agencies. Basically, I lead the Salesforce architecture there. So I get an opportunity to get involved in a lot of interview process, and I'm referring this from a New Zealand perspective. I'm very flexible when it comes to interview, right? Because um, the first thing I believe, right, the person you're going to interview, you got to make sure that person is comfortable because it's not an interrogation round, right? You're not interrogating somebody. It's not a military interrogation, right? You're bringing in your test subject to say, "Hey, sit in the room. I'm going to interview you." Or interrogate you. That's not how I love to do interview. I wanted to make sure when I interview somebody, I wanted to make sure the person is comfortable. When a person is comfortable, right, they tend to give their best in an interview. That's what I believe. And I wanted to have interview in a form of a discussion round, right? Like a casual conversation, right? Two buddies meeting together for a pint and talking about Salesforce. That's the kind of approach I often take. But that being said, excuse me, a few things I look for when I interview somebody, especially from a Salesforce developer position. Now, the difficulty or intensity of question varies depending upon the years of experience. So if I'm interviewing somebody who's, let's say, intermediary, then my questions will vary. But if I'm interviewing somebody who is a senior guy, then my question will vary. Let's assume like I'm interviewing, let's say, intermediary to senior guy. So for me, senior is somebody who got 10 years experience in Salesforce ecosystem. I do not consider somebody senior with 3 to 4 experience. That is a junior to intermediary for me, right? 5 to 7 years, I often consider as intermediary, not really senior, because unless they have a very strong enterprise development experience, then it's a different story. But usually, because I'm in New Zealand, right? I mean, it might vary in your country, but here I expect somebody with at least with 10 years experience to consider for a senior role or a staff engineer role, right? Right. So these are the things I look, as you can see on my screen. Apex programming, obviously, I expect you to have a very good understanding of Apex. When I mean Apex, you should know object-oriented side of Apex, when to use interface, when to use polymorphism, right? Um, I expect you to have a decent understanding of object-oriented concept because I will not appreciate if you come to me and say, "Hey, I have 10 years experience, but I've used Apex in a procedural way." That's just not good enough because then I will not be very keen to proceed further with the interview because you are a project risk to me. Because if somebody don't understand an object-oriented concept, right, or at least to give a try, then it is a very serious project risk to me, and I will not be interested to even proceed further, right? Because I'm very blunt, right? Obviously, it's good to let the person know, right, rather than wasting their time if you're not looking to hire them, right? So that's a red flag for me. So like I said, right, Apex programming, you should understand object oriented concept very well. And I mean, like I said, interfaces, right? It's okay if you haven't done interfaces, but at least if you can give me a good reasoning behind why we need to use interfaces, right? Why we need to inherit a class, um, and why do we need to use overload or override, that kind of things, right? And I'm pretty flexible. Then comes to the flows, right? Why do we need to use flows? When do we need to use flows? Have you considered large data volume, right? Because most of the people say, I've done flows, but then when I start asking question, can you explain to me single responsibility principle or open close principle using flows? They kind of look at me as if I've asked them something very strange. And that is a red flag for me because if you have worked on flow, you should know the concept of modularity principle. Why do we use open close principle? Why do we need a single responsibility principle? And if you said you have, you need to explain to me how you do it, right? So we start with a scenario, and because the reason why I asked this, right? For me, flow is a drag and drop visual component, but I want people to build it in the right way, not to add tech debt, right? That's the main thing. And if you have an existing flows, the things that you consider to improve it, right? For instance, a fault line. If you are doing a CRUD operation in a flow, right, I would expect you to keep the fault line into consideration because what if the things go wrong? How are you capturing the error, right? And yeah, that kind of things. So it's very important for me to know, right? And I get very picky because people say, so I've bought lots of many years experience in flows, and they start explaining to me. Then I start asking, okay, have you used platform event based flows, right? And what are the challenges you face? How do you bulkify a flow, right? And what happens if flow started throwing exceptions? How are you going to measure that performance, right? Those kind of things is very important. Can you do like 10 CRED operation in the flow? Can you do different operation in a single flow, right? Okay. And what's the use of subflows? And how do you use auto launch flows, right? That kind of things I would like to know. And can you have more than one flow for a same object, right? And if you're planning to have more than one flow, and what's the reason behind it? Are you using it in the form of a trigger? Then comes to that kind of questions I will obviously end up in asking. And visual force pages, I'm not very picky about it, but if you said you have worked on it, then I might ask a few questions. If you say I haven't, I just say okay, let's move on. Lightning component framework. Usually, this is about Aura framework, um, because the reason why I put this topic. Some people say they have worked extensively on Aura framework, so then I start asking questions around Aura framework. I just it's not a biggie thing for me because if you haven't done it, it's fine. But most of the time, people say they have worked on Aura framework, so I started asking questions around that. So um, data modeling is very important. So I might ask you a question around entity relationship. Um, you know, how do you the difference between the keys, what kind of keys we have. I just to throw people off the boat, I often ask, do we have a concept of secondary keys, composite keys? Um, you know, just to know if they've worked on the object-based data model in Salesforce because it's a bit different to SQL, right? And lookup relationship, master detail relationship, roll-up summaries. These kind of questions I often ask people, right? And triggers and trigger frameworks, right? Now, obviously, I would like to know if they've used any trigger frameworks because obviously most of the people do these days. But if they haven't, that's fine. That's not a. But at least I wanted to understand the concept. How do you write a trigger? Do you write a business logic inside a trigger? How do you maintain separation of concern principle? And how do you call a selector class? That kind of things I would like to know, right? Because obviously, if you are intermediary senior, I would expect you to have a decent understanding of it. Then obviously I would like to know the governance limits, integration. How do you do integration in Salesforce? Have you used external services? Have you used MuleSoft or have you used Delbumi or have you used any middleware? If you're using point to point, the use of name credentials, um, and yeah, that kind of and stuff. Can you do integration using flows other than external service? Now we have HTTPS component, right? And what's the drawback of it? And what happens if you have an existing Apex integration? And how do you go about it? And error handling and integrations, that kind of thing. And where does the Loga framework sit when it comes to integration? How do you log an integration logs, right? LDS is it just a question I put on people. Usually I ask, have you done anything on SLDS? If they say yes, I ask them, explain to me, and we move on. Batch apex and schedule jobs. So I normally ask questions about batch class, future methods, right? Um, yeah, so just to know their understanding, right? When do we use the batch apex, right? And in that I often, ask them question around, uh, give me any scenario which you have recently worked on where you think the batch apex is very important, and what's the challenges you encounter, right? And then security is very important. Security, like permission set, profiles. I mean, you'll be surprised, right? I've seen people even with sharing visibility architecture certification, get the security wrong, and it frustrates me to the core, right? If people have, because usually, right, when it comes to interview, I normally don't care about your certification. It's nice to have, right? I mean, if you have Platform Dev 1, Platform Dev 2, or any architecture certification, but if you get the security damn wrong, I will not let you. I will say interview is over because it frustrates me. If you don't understand the Salesforce security, then you are a serious risk to working on the org. Because if you don't understand the permission set architecture, permission set group, when to use it, you'll be surprised. People sometimes, come up with a random, I don't even want to be rude. People don't know what do we use permissions are for, right? And I was wondering, how do you manage to get the security architecture certification if you don't know? And public groups, and when do we use public groups, right? And how do you use sharing rules? Apex managed sharing. These things, I mean, yeah, these things I often ask, especially if you're a senior developer, right? And metadata API, if you have worked on it, uh, I normally ask. Change management. This is very important for me if you have worked on Git or any source control, or because place where I work we use Git, right? We use CI/CD, so it doesn't matter which tools you've used. You could have used GitLab, you could have used GitHub, you could have used Bitbucket, SVN. It doesn't matter for me, or Jenkins, right? As long as you know how the stuff works. DevOps is very important. It's very important for a developer, at least, to how to push your code to a repo, how to do a cherry picking. These things are very important. If you're not comfortable, I'm not really comfortable, right? Because then I'm getting a person in with so many years experience who can't do Git, who can't do cherry picking, who can't do DevOps. Then it's more like a liability. So I prefer not to get that person, right? My interview, although is very casual, but I'm very picky when it comes to hiring people. Governance and compliance, it's about GDPR, just to know if you understand the compliance, right? Sometimes we deal with the customer data. The customer could be from a European Union, could be from, you might be dealing with the health data. So if you are looking to hire somebody for a health role, then obviously I will probably need to understand if you understand HL7 standard, for instance, if you understand health compliance, like California has their own health compliance, right? For a Privacy Act, you have GDPR from a European Union perspective. So I will probably query you on that stuff. Debugging and performance tuning, obviously, you should know how to debug it, right? And if you don't know how to debug a log using Visual Studio, that's going to raise a red flag for me, because obviously, as a developer, you should know how to do that. I know that using a Salesforce is not very sophisticated, like Visual Studio when it comes to C Sharp debugging, right? You get interactive debugging in a very efficient way. In Salesforce, you need to download the log, and you can use an interactive debugger using Visual Studio Code, which is very effective, but it's not very robust like Visual Studio as such. I'm not talking about Visual Studio Code, I'm talking Visual Studio using C Sharp, right? Very effective, very powerful IDE. If you have used it, you know what I'm talking about. So debugging and performance tuning, development best practices like coding standard, how many params you have in a method, right? Separation of concern principle. Do you select a class? Why do you select a class? what design pattern you use. Now, coming to design pattern, right? I've written a book on Apex design pattern. If you're interested, right? I'm not selling it. This is not a marketing session. Um, and so if you are interested, you can go and buy it. So I'll show you the link in a second. Sorry, that's my another book. I'll talk about in a second. So design scalable Apex application with Apex design. So because Cohen, that's my name because I'm a Jewish guy, so that's why you can see my name. Um, and I'm not trying to sell this to you, but if you want, you can buy it. So I put a lot of design pattern in it, Apex stuff, and I use all my experience in it. People have bought it and they liked it. A couple of my mates they bought it who works in Salesforce. They liked it, and if you want hardcover, you can buy the hardcover, right? That's something. And I'm working on another book that's a transhumanism because I'm a transhumanist. I run a climate change foundation and a transhumanism foundation where we talk about integrating humans with machines. So this is one of my theses when I was at MIT. So I wanted to put that into paper. So I'm publishing this next month in a Kindle version first. Like as you can see, the transcending Homo sapiens, right? Um, it's similar, like that Yuval Harari. He's an Israeli historian, so who talks about transhumanism and dataism and other stuff, right? So not exactly similar to what I'm doing, but I'm more focused on what it means to live in a world where humans get integrated with the machines, compliance, right? What happens in terms of education and a different kind of stuff, right? Sorry, I digress. Don't want to distract. Test automation, right? So it's normally talking about unit test frameworks. If you have used anything like, for instance, FFlib has a framework you can use for testing, or Apex. There are different frameworks out there. So if you have worked on it, pretty cool. LWC is very important. If you're a developer, you should know LWC, right? JavaScript. I might ask you about ECMAScript latest standards, how to use arrow function, that kind of things. Any JavaScript design patterns you've used, right? And I don't normally ask people about HTML and the stuff, right? Um, and style CSS stuff. I expect people to know that, and it's kind of silly that for me to get into the explain to me about this node, explain to me about that node. I don't normally do that. If a person has done LWC, I expect them to know. I normally ask the best practices they've followed on that place, right? Because I don't really care about the syntax. I know you can Google it, you can figure that out, right? That's just a freaking waste of time. And people who do that for somebody who has 10 years experience, they honestly don't know what they're interviewing, right? They're just wasting person time. I normally don't do that. For me, if you're somebody with 10 years experience, I just wanted to know the standards you've followed, the things you're passionate about, and things what you've done, why you've done it, right? Rather than knowing, okay, write me a Apex code with set or map. I honestly don't care. That's just a BS, right? If I'm interviewing for Omni Studio, I might get into Omni Studio, like OmniScript, data raptors, best practices using integration procedure, that kind of stuff, right? And why do we need to use Apex with integration procedure? Where do we use it? And what kind of call-ups we need to do? And error handling and try catch. The few basic things I get into, right? If you are really looking for Omni Studio, or for that matter, any of the cloud, like Experience Cloud, Health Cloud, right? I've done a lot of work on Health Cloud, so I normally query people on data model when it comes to Health Cloud. If you're looking for one of the Health Cloud resource, and Sales Clouds, Service Cloud, basic stuff, right? I don't normally get into the fancy stuff, as long as people can do these things, right? And I'm pretty confident, right? The person can work on a platform easily, right? So if I'm happy with all these points, right? I'm fairly confident the person can do the job, right? And rest of the clouds, if they haven't worked on it, that's fine. Who cares? Person can learn it, right? Because you pretty much don't know everything that's going on in our Salesforce ecosystem. It's huge, right? And then we have Marketing Cloud, right? So CPQ Cloud Developer, um, And you have a lot of, because in Marketing Cloud, you get into server side JavaScript, AMP script, right? So that's a different area. So I normally query that if I'm interviewing for MC, but for Salesforce, these are the things I normally look for. So yeah, that's pretty much I wanted to cover. Hope you guys find this session useful. See, the reason why I talked about it, right? Because like I said, I've been interviewing a lot of people, um, especially in New Zealand, right? And I understand the market has dried down a bit, and I've interviewed even people from Australia too in the past. So these are the two places because I live in New Zealand, so obviously I look after the New Zealand market. And please don't email me saying, hey, is there any requirement? We are not hiring, right? I mean, I work for a government agency. We are absolutely not hiring freeze. Our Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, right? Uh, he's a great guy. I like him. He's a pretty amazing Prime Minister. So his government, because we have a coalition government in New Zealand, he said we should be cutting down people from government agencies. So, place where I work, there will be 6.5% cost cut. It's going to happen. Ministry of Health, they had a cost cut. Basically, our government said, you work for a government agency, bugger off, right? We hired too many people during the COVID time. We're going to let go a lot of people. So that's exactly what government is doing. So there's no hiring happening. So in from a New Zealand perspective, some companies here and there, but not much, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. Please don't email me to say, hey, there's a requirement. I mean, if you live in New Zealand, if you have a work permit or resident right or citizen, I can probably point you to a right, a consultant or a recruitment agent, and so yeah, who can help? But I'm not into recruitment, so that's pretty much I wanted to cover in this episode. Hope you guys have an amazing Tuesday. Adios.